Some types of network attacks are specific to a certain type of application, for example, to a web application. One of the things that we're talking about here is cross-site request forgeries, otherwise shortened down to CSRF. You'll see that a lot in literature. But what is a cross-site request forgery? Well, generally speaking, what happens is attackers can target victim users and their session tokens. Now, what does that mean? Sounds like a lot of fancy talk. Well, imagine this. As a user, you sign on to online banking. When that happens, you have an HTTPS connection, hopefully, otherwise find a new bank. And then what happens is your web browser will have a cookie that uniquely identifies your session. And so that cookie then allows you to continue with transactions until the banking website times out. Perhaps you've noticed that if you sign into online banking and you step away for 10 minutes and you were signed in, it'll time out. Well, that means that you're going to get a new token or a new cookie for a new session. However, what if an attacker happens to be able to break into your computer in some way? They can hijack your web browser, maybe because they tricked you into clicking a link, so now they have access to your cookies. You can imagine the implications, but let's spell it out. It means that an attacker then would have access to an authenticated banking session in our example, and they would then be able to send malicious requests, in this case, to the session that the user is already authenticated with. This is transparent. Nobody knows it's happening except for the attacker. And as you might guess, the attacker might be able to send requests that would transmit funds between accounts or do wire transfers. And it's not as if this is going to pop up all the screens and the user is going to see it. That's not how it works. This happens in the background. The user doesn't even know what's happening. So that's why it's so important to harden all user devices, including smartphones and tablets. Now, that is called a cross-site request forgery, but we also have a server-side equivalent. It's still a cross-site request forgery, but it's happening at the server side. What I just described happened on the client side with their authenticated browser session. So with the server-side request forgery, the target is not an individual client session, but rather a web server. And if an attacker can compromise a web server, they will be able to have that server make requests to other servers on the malicious attacker's behalf. Let's put that into perspective. Let's frame it with an example. Let's say that we have a front-end web server that talks to a back-end database. And that database contains customer information. This is a public-facing website in our example. If an attacker can compromise that web server, and if it's susceptible to a server-side request forgery, the attacker could formulate a request. They could craft a malicious request for that front-end web server, where that web server would then say, well, I have access to that back-end database. Sure, I'll go get you all of the customer records, and here they are. That's what can play out. Now let's look at this in an animation. In step one, with a cross-site request forgery on the client side, we have a user, as we've mentioned, that authenticates to the bank. Now, it's a legitimate bank site, legitimate login session. Now, number two, the user is still logged in. The session hasn't timed out, and the user is tricked somehow into maybe visiting a fake website, opening an infected file, maybe even clicking an ad that looks legitimate. But when they click the ad, it's executing malicious code on the machine that lets the attacker gain access to their cookies. Remember, this is the authentication token example. So what happens then is in step three, the user unknowingly, their machine is sending malicious requests that are created by the malicious attacker. So the user doesn't know what's happening. According to the bank, it's a legitimate login session. There's no signs of fraud or impersonation here. And so that's why we have to be careful with this type of attack. Now, what do you mean be careful? What can we do about this? Well, we already said we should harden client devices. That's a part of it. Another aspect is using a web application firewall. We talked about a lot of different firewalls in this series, one of which was a web application firewall. That solution is designed to look for exactly what we're describing here and mitigate against it or prevent it.